Whether you're a new or experienced climber, you've probably encountered lots of advice from other climbers about training, technique, rehab, beta, etc. And often that's a great thing. Good advice helps us learn and succeed. But unfortunately, there's also plenty of suboptimal advice floating around, sometimes even from super strong climbers, that often hinders or even reverses people's progress. So in this video, we're going to dismantle and debunk my top 5 worst pieces of advice climbers give each other. We'll also suggest a better alternative for each piece of advice. Number 5, climb with straight arms and rely on your skeletal structure. This might be the most common piece of advice for new climbers ever. But before we dismantle it, I want to first mention what I like about it. It is absolutely true that newer climbers, and even some intermediate climbers, have a habit of staying very tight and contracted in their upper bodies, especially their arms. And it's also true that this is generally not a good thing. It uses up a lot of energy to maintain these positions, plus it doesn't allow you to take advantage of leverage, counterweight, and momentum that allows strong, efficient movement on the wall. So yes, it is true that this is not good to do all the time, and this is useful for many situations. Beyond that, however, this advice quickly becomes problematic. The real reason this straight arm position is more energy efficient is not because you're hanging from your skeleton, it's because you're simply not contracting as many muscles as intensely as you are when you're all tight and bent armed. By minimizing unnecessary muscle contractions, your body literally uses less energy. The PT in me always chuckles a bit when I hear hang from your skeleton, because you're always hanging from your skeleton. That's what your muscles and connective tissue are attached to. You can certainly relax your muscles so your joints go into a more passive position, and sometimes that will transfer some of the load to your connective tissues, but that definitely is not a universally good thing that we should be doing all the time. The second issue is that this advice is usually given with little to no context or explanation, meaning it's unclear how it should be applied. Am I always supposed to climb with straight arms? Should I always be in this super relaxed position? The layman is forced to interpret it however they can. Should I disengage all the muscles in my upper body? My arms are loose, so maybe my shoulders should be loose too. This is definitely not what you want to do. In fact, it's a risky habit to get into that I've actually seen contribute to a shoulder dislocation, as well as plenty of other less severe injuries. In reality, climbing should involve a constant cycle of relax, set up, contract, catch, and repeat. Should that be a new shirt? This is one important method we need to be practicing, but it's simply not taught to many climbers. In fact, I've seen many times where this straight arm hanging from your skeleton advice becomes so ingrained in people that it actually stops them from completing moves that would be easy if they bent their arms and engaged their upper bodies more. So in summary, I have nothing against climbers who have given or received this advice, but I think we can do much better. Number 4, you just need stronger tendons. By far one of the most common complaints you'll hear from climbers is, if only my tendons were stronger. Maybe they try that one crimpy climb in the gym and get annoyed when they can't pull the moves, even though the climb is a grade or two below what they're used to sending. Those holds are just so darn small and painful, your finger tendons must be too weak to handle them, right? Maybe you need to spend more time hangboarding to strengthen those bad boys up. Well, the answer to both those questions is probably no, but let me explain. One of the biggest misconceptions in climbing is that grip strength is primarily determined by the tendons in our fingers. This is inaccurate for a few different reasons. While tendons are extremely useful for absorbing and transmitting energy, among other purposes, they have no motor units. That means that tendons cannot produce volitional force. In other words, a tendon doesn't flex our fingers. The flexor tendons run from the tips of our fingers down to the FDP and FDS muscles in our forearms. The muscles contract, pulling on the tendons and flexing our fingers. You can have the strongest tendons in the world, but if they aren't attached to an adequately strong muscle, we wouldn't be able to hold on to anything. But Jason, you say, sure, you need strong flexor muscles, but those tiny holds are so painful, it feels like my tendons can't handle it. Why else would climbers always be worried about popping a tendon? Well, to be fair, grip strength is not solely reliant on muscular strength. Of course, we need adequate strength in our flexor tendons and other connective tissue in our hands to be able to grip hard. However, our flexor tendons are robust pieces of connective tissue. In fact, I've never seen, nor can I find a single confirmed case study of a finger flexor tendon rupturing due to climbing. Some smaller strains can occur, but those mostly happen from traumatic injuries rather than just crimping hard. Of course, if you have other types of connective tissue or joint injuries in your fingers, your brain will limit the amount of force you can generate with your flexor muscles, but that's a completely separate issue and is not evidence that your flexor tendons are too weak. So why are we making such a big deal about all of this? Mainly because the idea that your tendons are somehow too weak is just not very accurate or helpful, and it's important to be accurate when discussing anatomy and training. Imagine you start plateauing on your weighted pull-ups. You wouldn't blame the tendons that connect your lats to your spine, would you? Besides, your tendons are stimulated every time you use the muscle that they attach to. You can't train the muscle without using the tendon as well. Lastly, if you agree with all that, you might still be tempted to argue that tendon strength must be important since hangboarding is an effective training tool. This is the last misconception, that one part of the system, aka the tendons, is more important than the other components. Hangboarding involves an isometric contraction of what? That's right, our flexor muscles. It also involves a resistance to elongation from our connective tissues. And yes, of course, hangboarding does stimulate the flexor tendons as well. There are indeed times when the pulleys can be more limiting than the musculotendinous structure and vice versa. However, it would still be a mistake to discredit the function of the system as a whole. In fact, in a study on muscle and tendon adaptations, the researchers concluded that the muscle and tendon adaptations appeared to occur in synergy, presumably to maintain the efficacy of the muscle-tendon unit. Number 3, tendons take several years to strengthen in climbers. This myth tends to be used as a justification for telling newer climbers not to use the hangboard or not to climb on cramps. You've probably heard that tendons take much longer to strengthen than muscles do, therefore you need to be extra careful during your first 1, 2, 3, 5, or even 7 years of climbing because your tendons haven't caught up to your muscles. But we actually have compelling evidence that this is totally wrong for a few reasons. Perhaps the simplest evidence is that tendons, when injured, heal in a matter of weeks or months, not years. Even fully ruptured pulley ligaments, which probably get far less blood flow than our tendons, can stitch themselves back together in a handful of months. The second factor to consider is that we probably shouldn't be worried about our tendon strength in isolation in the first place. As we established in the previous section, our ligaments, tendons, and muscles are all part of a cohesive unit that is working together. So something like hangboarding can actually increase the adaptation rate of that entire system, which would lead to more robust tissues that are actually less prone to injury. The third and perhaps most important piece of evidence we should consider is the literal scientific evidence. Research shows that there is an acute molecular response to exercise with regard to collagen synthesis. In other words, when we exercise, the mechanism in our body that leads to stronger tendons is activated very quickly. Furthermore, there is data that shows the actual structure of a tendon can thicken in just 4 to 8 weeks of training, so the tendon is actually getting stronger in just weeks. Now, research on long-term tendon hypertrophy is much more limited, especially directly related to climbers. Part of this is because it depends on many individual factors like genetics, diet, training history, etc. But suffice it to say that climbers are far too focused on blaming tendons when the real issue may be muscular strength or training errors. Number 2, if you're injured, you need full rest. A lot of climbers probably encountered the flaws of this advice during the COVID lockdowns. Many were forced to take an extended rest, and when they finally got to go climbing again, they were shocked to find out some old injury was still very much so a problem. How could it not have healed with all that rest? While some acute injuries will certainly need a period of initial rest, these days we have a plethora of research showing that early, safe loading of injured tissue promotes improved outcomes, strength, and pain scores. By just resting, your tissue may heal, but it will likely be at a slower rate, which will also mean more muscle atrophy, aka you lose your gains. And some injuries will just straight up refuse to stop nagging you no matter how much rest you give them. Why does this happen? Well, muscles, tendons, and ligaments tend to need some external stimulus to trigger full healing and strengthening adaptations. Especially when it comes to climbing injuries, often your daily activities will not provide enough stimulus to make those adaptations happen. Some amount of pain science will come into play as well. Pain is not as straightforward as you might think. Some injuries will continue to feel painful even after the tissue has healed because your nervous system still views that load as a threat. To solve this, you need to reintroduce those loads to the tissue in a safe and controlled manner to teach your brain that everything is a-okay. So, if you want to heal back to full strength as quickly as possible, using an active rehab plan is key. Number 1, if you find a weakness, you should train to fix it. I think this one stems from the fact that once we find a weakness, it feels good to work towards correcting it, like plugging a hole in our armor. Not only can we jump to conclusions and think that this weakness is going to cause an injury, but a lot of athletes experience plateaus and then think that the plateau must be caused by a specific weakness that they just haven't discovered yet. As a result, whenever a new weakness is discovered, dramatic steps are taken to correct it. But after all that hard work correcting the weakness, what happened to your climbing? Did you climb a grade harder? Are you climbing the same grade but feeling like every move is easier? Or did nothing significantly change? This is the challenge. Not all weaknesses are weaknesses that need to be trained because not all weaknesses are relevant to your goals. Thus, training those weaknesses won't necessarily improve your climbing or whatever your goal is. The biggest problem with not critically thinking like this is that training every single weakness you come across costs you time and energy that could have been spent accomplishing your actual goals. Finally, how do we assess how much weakness is truly a problem? Self-assessment is quite difficult with these things, as there is no perfect guide to strength benchmarks you need to hit for each grade. Comparing yourself to other people and averages can be insightful to some extent, but it often gets vastly overemphasized and ends up making people chase averages rather than actual self-improvement. Thinking critically about your climbing and training, tracking your results and optimizing as you go, and having an awareness of, but not obsession with, other people's benchmarks is the best way to improve, in my opinion. And of course, a knowledgeable coach that takes the time to understand your real strengths and weaknesses can be invaluable. Side note, if you've never tracked your training before but are interested in starting, we've included a link to a free Google Sheets template you can use to start today. Of course, we'll also have Dan's info linked in the description as well. So, should you train all weaknesses? No, you should train relevant weaknesses. What's some advice that you've received that you don't find very helpful or that is highly questionable? Until next time, train relevant weaknesses, climb without blaming your tendons, send it with straight and bent arms, and repeat.